This episode contains specific and graphic information about a crime. Please be advised.
How would an oxycodone have killed him? That just didn't make any sense. And unfortunately, that's how we learned about fentanyl.
Welcome to the very first episode of True Crime Prevention, the podcast that melds true crime with real solutions. Let's expose how all crime starts the same way, with a chance. Today, we won't give it a chance. I'm Paul DelPonte, and I work with McGruff the Crime Dog. Thank you for joining us. I can think of no better first guest to start this podcast off than Amy Neville. Over the years, I've gotten to know Amy, and she's really become a true hero for her courage, conviction, in all that she does day in and day out. And I can attest to you, it's a full day. Amy's background, yoga instructor, mom, average American household. And then one morning that all changed when she and her family woke up and her son Alexander did not. And we're going to get into some real topics today involving drugs, crime, accomplices to crime, and how technology is accelerating and endangering kids. So Amy, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. I'm so grateful for your guys' partnership over the last couple of years.
And it's really wonderful, and we'll get into more of your work and the foundation you set up and all that you do. Take a moment for our viewers and listeners. Click like and subscribe and get us off to a good start. So, Amy, why don't we start by, before we get into the crime, tell us about Alexander, just as a person.
Sure. Alexander was my thrill seeker, my adventure guy. He was a brilliant kiddo. He was also very intense. Like his brilliancy matched his intensity, that's for sure. He loved to learn about everything and anything that was fascinating to him, starting really young with Egyptology when he was 3 years old, all the way through to, Civil War. He loved American history, skateboarding. He was, when he had an interest, he'd become really dedicated to it. At the time of his death, he was selling off his childhood toys on eBay, and he was really good about it. He set up his own account. He had packaged up everything that he had listed and had it all ready to go and was delivering packages every day to the UPS store. And so, like I said, he was good at that. Now, I wish he was had applied that type of passion to school, but not so much. He was the kiddo in school that could pass the tests with an A. And so why do I have to do homework? Tough argument. I have to agree with him, right? But there's still responsibilities. And so that was always a struggle, but he was our big ideas kid. Most of our interests, things that we did in life, going to Comic-Con, Lego fests, Civil War reenactments, they were all based on his interests.
Terrific. Well, and we're going to talk about drugs and opioids. And a lot of people jump to the assumption, oh, there must be an addiction and there must be a problem. But that wasn't the case here, right? That wasn't the case. We, now Alexander being an experimental kiddo, just by nature, we knew that this kid was probably going to have an experimental phase at some point. And we did our best to be on guard for that. We talked about substance misuse all through his short little life and what that meant. We tried to appeal to his intellect rather than being like, don't do drugs are bad. Talking about really the why and the science behind it. And he listened to that. But this day came in June of 2020 where things were just off. And so I asked him, I'm like, okay, dude, what is going on? Are you using something? And his response was no. I was up late, I ate something bad. 14, height of puberty. So his moodiness was in line with his personality. And so we let it go. But he came back to me and he said, it was a day and a half later. And he said, okay, I got to talk to you guys. I wanted to experiment with Oxy. I got it from a dealer on Snapchat. It has a hold on me and I don't know why. That's the short story. And that following morning, I called a place to get him in for help. That night he died. Everything happened really fast. My estimate, it was 10 days from that first pill to the day that he died. So that morning when you woke up, so you had an inkling of what it was. And I assume you called 911 and the police came.
So that
the plan was to get him into treatment that day, and I called, and they needed to call me back. And so that morning when I found him, his dad instantly called 911. I clinged on to his sister because she tried to run up and help with CPR. Of course, she's only 12. She had no business in that space. And so I was protecting her from that. Paramedics came, administered naloxone, took him to the hospital, but it was too late. I mean, and it was so confusing because how would an oxycodone have killed him? That just didn't make any sense. And unfortunately, that's how we learned about fentanyl.
Right. And the rest, from what I know, and we'll unravel this more for our listeners, but really became an education beyond things you wished and thought you'd never know, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
So the police came. I assume they collected evidence to some extent, or
so our local sheriff's department, they actually didn't do any. They didn't come back and do anything. A friend of my sister-in-law was part of a founding task force down in San Diego, and that task force came up to our home as a favor to her, and they were able to explain to us what was going on. And then at that point, they turned it over to the DEA since it was the DEA's jurisdiction.
Okay. And then at what point and how did they discover it was fentanyl?
So they were able to test a pill that was left behind in his room, and it tested positive for fentanyl.
Okay.
And in fact, when my sister walked into my house that day, she said, "Don't touch anything in his room. It's fentanyl." And I didn't know what she meant by that.
Right.
But they work in law enforcement, so they have knowledge that I don't.
And to go back in time to 2020, which is not all that long ago, most people had not heard of fentanyl.
No, we were not talking about it.
Right. And oftentimes it's criminal behavior that is a couple steps ahead of us.
Yep.
And, something to be always on the alert for, and how we unfortunately have to sometimes live our lives. Yeah. So did the sheriff take a more active role at that point? Or was it still left in DA's hands?
It went to the DEA, and I had some contact with them. They had asked for some more information and things along the way, and where did he get it? But at the time we were very confused, and I had gone back to the sheriff because I had developed a relationship with the sheriff at that point and asked him to take a look at it again. And so he called the DEA, but he got back to me and told me it was better left with the DEA at that point.
Okay. And again, because we're going back in time to some things that were not well known in 2020, Alex thought he was getting oxy. Is that correct?
Yeah. It was advertised to him. The dealer told him it was oxycodone. And so Alex thought it was. However, the dealer knew that his drugs were deadly. Someone had actually died in this dealer's apartment from this dealer's drugs 2 weeks prior to Alex.
Mm. And so the dealer was identified?
So, I had gone out to lunch with one of Alexander's friends 2 months later, and on a whim, I just asked her, do you know where he got it? And she was able to provide me with the Snapchat drug dealer's information. And, that's when I remembered Alex telling us about Snapchat in our conversation. And so I was able to turn that over to the DEA. And then later on, another mom reached out to me about another 2 months later, said, "Are you Amy Neville?" I said, "Yeah." She's like, I've got something to show you. That night, she sent me pictures of this drug dealer talking about Alex on Snapchat.
Oh, well, I'm sorry you had to hear that.
Yeah. And then when I go back and I look at the police report, I can see, or when I look at the coroner's report for that time frame, I can see other deaths related to this drug dealer.
Now, I'm going to get back to this a couple times as we talk in this interview, but that was in the short couple minutes we've already been on. You've mentioned this Snapchat about a dozen times. For those who aren't familiar, Snapchat is a social media platform. It's had its ups and downs. I would describe it as it's doing in terms of other social media platforms. It's a struggling platform, I think would be fair. And it's also been the target. I know it's been the target of our own National Crime Prevention Council scrutiny and alerting the U.S. Attorney General and state attorney generals to it and to the problems with it. And that's attracted some attention.
But tell us a little bit, when did you start getting, at this point, did you start getting suspicious about why a platform was playing such a key role in this?
So it was, at first I thought this was a one-off situation that happened in our family. And I quickly learned that this was a thing. Families were waking up to their kids dead in their bedrooms from drugs off of Snapchat across the United States. And so I was frustrated, and we, some of us that had that experience were on a call. And in that call, I asked, when are we going to get angry at Snapchat? And there was a parent on that call that said, no, we want to work with them. We want to work with them from the inside and tell them what's wrong with their product. And so I thought, okay, that seems reasonable, right? Because they must not know. And fast forward a few months later, we're having this meeting with them, and Snap starts off just basically saying, so sorry for your loss. We had no idea this was such a problem. But that's not true. They're warned. You can see it showing up in the news as early as 2017 saying, Snap, you have a drug problem on your platform. And if you don't fix it now, it's going to be out of control. And here we are, the side effects of that out of control.
Wow. So I want to go back, ask DA, was the drug dealer ever apprehended?
He was never apprehended in Alexander's case. My fantasy of how it was all going to go down was he would get arrested in one of these other families' cases, and I could go support them, because I don't know why, I just don't think I could stomach that kind of a trial. But I could support people going through it for sure. I know that they brought him in a couple of times. I do know through the investigative reporting of Paul Solotarov that they did question him at least on 2 occasions about Alex, but he got a lawyer, and that was that.
That was that. Yeah. Now, tell us a bit about, you slowly and then more rapidly became more and more engaged as an educator, a parent advocate, and other things. Mm-hmm. What motivated you?
So what motivated me was talking to young people. So we started off, I was trying to understand this problem from all the different angles. And so I started meeting with experts, and that includes, law enforcement, attorneys, doctors, psychologists, really trying to wrap my mind around it. And when it came time to create content or make our first presentations, something was missing, and that was the youth perspective. And once I started talking to youth in November of 2020, that just blew my mind. The things that they're experiencing, seeing what's happening to them in these online spaces is vast and it's deep. And we're not talking about that nowhere near enough. And all these families think, not my kid would never do that. But these kids are telling me how they're getting the inappropriate pictures, how they're being bullied, or how drug dealing's happening, and they're experiencing it, and they're not talking to their trusted adult about it.
And it's interesting because I think when you talk to most adults, they hear about things on the internet, but it's distant, I think.
Yeah.
And when you say, oh, not my kid, or my kid's too young, generally speaking, if things start happening when a kid is 14, 13, 12, you need to start educating them well before those birthdays.
Absolutely. And these kids tell me all the time, even in elementary school, I've been doing a lot in elementary schools lately. These elementary school kids are seeing the same things. Their parents are giving them a phone to go to bed with, to read or watch YouTube or some kind of device. Watch this until you fall asleep. And these kids are veering away from what it is they're supposed to be watching. And they're going onto these other platforms, and they're seeing harms and not telling their parents.
Absolutely. And we use this term harms, and I've picked up on something, is that is very vague. You ask a child, have you ever encountered any internet harms? They say no. You ask a parent, has your child ever encountered any internet harms, or are you? And you say no. But then you go back and you ask that kid, has anyone tried to engage you in a sexually graphic conversation, or tried to share sexual pictures with you, or talked about drugs? And generally speaking, if the kid has spent any amount of time on a social media platform, especially one like Snapchat, the answer is yes.
Absolutely. A little over a year ago now, I added the question, have you seen anybody die on social media, in my teen listening sessions? And the first time I asked it, I really thought they were going to look at me like I was crazy. Like, what a crazy question to ask us. No, but 5 of the 20 kids said yes. 2 of them had seen multiple people die. And then it led to this whole other conversation around animal abuse and seeing people getting beaten. And they had all experienced some level of that.
Right. Right. Now let's talk for a little bit more about Snapchat and the other social media companies, and what is emerging is really a drug distribution system that has allowed cartels and drug dealers to eliminate the typical street runners, the corner drug sales. And really, it's a kid picks up their phone, goes to an app, and getting drugs is almost or just as easy as getting fast food, because many times the dealer puts them in an Uber and they're delivered right to the doorstep. So you've learned a lot, obviously, in since 2020. And I suspect those are the things a parent doesn't naturally know, or you would expect a parent to know.
Exactly. And it's hard to think about those things that we didn't grow up with, right? Like, we're trying to guide our teens through their teen years based on our lived experience. And we don't have this lived experience. It's this huge black hole for us as parents, especially older parents like myself. So how can we think about that? And how do we talk about it when we haven't even had that happen ourselves? And so that's really where the gap is. And that's where the kiddos are able to give me the education that I need. And they tell me what it is they want their parents to know. And then I get to be the messenger of that and help parents understand. Even still, though, it's still hard for parents. Well, my kid's smarter than that, or my kid would never do that. So I try to approach parents on, here's why you need to know. Here's why your kid needs to know. Your kid could be the voice of reason. It could be their best friend. It could be your neighbor. And maybe your kid could help them in that situation. And that does help break down some of those barriers.
I think so too. And then I would also add to that list of people who need to open their minds and start thinking about this differently are policymakers. And you've just about made Washington your second home. You've been here so much testifying and talking to members of Congress and advocates, and encouraging people to do more. As I look at it, it seems like we're almost locked in a time capsule where people talk about, the war on drugs from the Nixon administration and Just Say No and Nancy Reagan and incarceration in the 90s. And sadly, that doesn't look at today's problem, which is vastly different due to the advent of what is called fake drugs. And this is what gets into the criminality of it. It is not an addiction issue. If you're 14 and you go online and you think you're buying Oxy or Adderall, well, that's not the right way to do it. And I think most kids realize, yeah, I should talk to my parents and doctor and all that. But they also don't think they're buying something lethal.
Right.
That will kill them in a few minutes. And that is it. So for those who are unfamiliar with fake drugs, Amy, I'll let you explain it a little bit.
Sure. So I will tell you, when I first started doing these listening sessions with teens, they didn't know anything about fentanyl. They thought, Adderall was Adderall, Xanax was Xanax, and so on. Nowadays, these drug dealers are still advertising that they have Adderall, Xanax, etc., but they're also advertising they have fentanyl, and so they make it look like it's its own drug, even though it is still counterfeited into all of these drugs. So there's this misconception out there that all these drugs are laced with fentanyl. That's not actually the case. No one's grinding up Oxy or Xanax, throwing in fentanyl and repressing these pills. They're flat out making, they're getting a binding agent. They're putting the fentanyl ingredients in there, mixing it up in a blender. So the distribution among the pills is not even. So we've all made chocolate chip or had chocolate chip cookies before, right? You mix in those chocolate chips, there's not an even distribution of chocolate chips. These counterfeit drugs are the same way. And so you might get one pill that doesn't do anything one day, but that next pill might end your life. And so it's hard to get people to think about that, because these kiddos believe that these drug dealers are their friends. They'd never do that to them. I've heard that time and time again. And so how do we breach that? How do we get kiddos and parents, for that matter, to understand what it is that they're really getting, and believing in that, because these drug dealers are smart. They use the fentanyl test strips now to show you, oh, look, there's no fent. They'll test the drugs. Of course, they're not testing the drugs that they're selling you. They're testing whatever fake batch they made that will be clear of these drugs. And so the other question we get all the time is, well, why would drug dealers want to kill their customers? And it's not that they want to kill their customers. It is just so incredibly cheap and profitable to make these drugs this way. It's just the cost of doing business, you know, these lost lives. And so they don't have to grow poppies, right, to make opium. They don't have to put armed guards on these poppies. They don't have to hope for a good crop yield. This cuts out that whole pipeline.
It cuts out that pipeline, and what has opened up is a new distribution pipeline, which is exceedingly dangerous, because when you look at something, as we mentioned, in 2020, few people have heard of fentanyl. Mm-hmm. And less than 3 years later, it's the leading cause of death among mm-hmm. teens. And the only way something like that could happen in that short a period of time is a result of technology. Now, giving these companies the benefit of the doubt, they did not set out to go into business to sell drugs.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree.
However, they knew well before 2020 that this was going on, and they did precious little, if anything, mm-hmm. to stop it. Would you say that's fair and accurate?
I think that's incredibly fair and accurate.
And what has happened, as I mentioned, and if you could imagine, you know, McGruff is famous for going back 3 generations now. And if you could imagine, if you took 1980s McGruff and put him in a cryogenic freezer, and then he woke up again today and he was at a police station and he said, oh, another teenager overdosed on fentanyl. He's like, all right, what corners are the drug dealers operating on? Mm-hmm. Let's cordon them off mm-hmm. and all this. And someone would actually have to explain to him, no, they pick up their cell phone and they order it on an app. And he'd be, what's an app? And you'd have to walk someone through all that. And it's not that long ago. I mean, we were kids with McGruff. And so within our lifetimes, the drug trade has changed dramatically, yet law enforcement, society has not kept pace with those changes to stop it. Mm-hmm. And that is really what I think Amy and others have been ringing the alarm bell at. We got to hurry up. We got to rethink mm-hmm. this.
Well, the dilemma with that too is, we have to get caught up, but as in getting caught up, we're still going to be behind because there's already all these new drugs on the horizon. Carfentanyl's out there. It's being mixed with other ingredients, other drugs, and we're losing life. We're having bigger and bigger issues. So how do we get ahead of it? I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did.
It's a big question, but it's a question we really need to start asking and get beyond rehashing the drug debate of the 1980s, because it is not.
Oh yeah, I mean, everybody keeps talking about the war on drugs, and it's
not your grandfather's war on drugs.
No, not at all. This is not the same
This is different. To that end, we are well aware of the role of technology in the sale of these drugs. Snapchat, mm-hmm. Meta, the other companies have all been implicated in mm-hmm. this and in other crimes. And yet they've evaded any further regulation. They've certainly evaded indictments and arrests. What makes, now, Snapchat has been called out by others, including our own organization, mm-hmm. For its particular problems. What makes it different in the eyes of a drug dealer?
So I really believe it's the disappearing messages. It gives them that anonymity. The evidence has been erased, essentially. And so there's no way to track it, to follow them.
But the drug dealer has the advantage of geolocating on their end.
Oh, the snap maps.
I'm telling you, their customer.
Mm-hmm. There is the Snap Map feature, which if anybody's kiddo has Snapchat, go in and turn off the locating services. Like that is one of the most dangerous things that that app has to offer.
And not just for drugs, for a lot of other
everything.
issues in which criminals prey on children around. So the CEO of Snapchat, Evan Spiegel, he has developed a reputation, or came into business with a reputation. And I know you've looked into it, I've looked into it, but can you tell us a little bit about sort of the evolution and the birth of Snapchat?
So my understanding, it was on Wikipedia. They had some of his emails on there. I think they've since been removed. But if you go back and look at the history of Snapchat, it started out as an app called Peekaboo, which was designed to basically take compromising pictures of women that would later delete. And they realized that mostly young people were on this app. And so they, in my opinion, I got to say, in my opinion, right? Because that keeps me hopefully out of legal trouble. But in my opinion, Snap saw the opportunity in making this look like it's for kids and making it look more friendly in an effort to get more users.
You know, as I looked at the features on Snapchat, it's often made me wonder, as you know, most products are developed after research and testing and focus groups and that kind of thing. Actually made me wonder if they've had some drug dealers sneaked into some of their focus groups to design the product. But they're not moving, and yet people are still downloading the app. And, I'm going to make an equation or a comparison. And now a little bit of good news. In the last year or so, there has been a 25% drop in young people dying from fentanyl. And a big part of that has been awareness and public education. Because, fighting a fake pill is like fighting an unknown enemy, which is difficult. And, getting beyond that. But let's go back. And the analogy I want to make is to cigarettes and smoking in public. For years, decades, people didn't realize the health effects of cigarette smoking, or certainly secondhand smoke. So it was commonplace to people light up in a restaurant, movie theater, or any other place. In the late 70s, early 80s, states began passing smoking in public ordinances. And those laws took effect. Some people complained, but they became effective. And they weren't effective because there was a police officer standing in the corner of every movie theater or every restaurant. They became effective because there would be somebody at the next table or the next row, and somebody would light up and say, "Hey, please put that out. You're not supposed to smoke in here." It became public pressure. Ultimately, Evan Spiegel, Mark Zuckerberg, they have the power and the ability to make their platform safer tomorrow.
Absolutely.
While we're pushing, and we won't stop pushing for legislation, because they haven't, and they probably won't without legislation, they could. And it was always public pressure that does the job. Yes, there were no smoking in public places laws passed. But what that really did, it didn't give more police power. Technically it did. But it gave citizens the ability to say, hey, you can't do that. And I think it is going to be public awareness that draws attention to, no, I'm not going to give my kid a cell phone at age 13. Or I'm going to, if I give him a cell phone, I have to approve all the apps. And and the companies need to make sure the kid can't get around that and things like that. What do you think it's going to take to make that kind of progress on this issue?
I honestly, if we're going to get to the public pressure piece where we're pressuring the CEOs of these companies, I don't want us to pressure each other. I mean, we do need a movement of parents that will not put their kids onto wait until 8th is an organization that does that. But it's going to take a lot of people to get that to happen. But I think we can get a lot of people those grassroots efforts to demand for that change. Right now, it's mostly impacted families that are doing that. There are some great orgs out there that are not impacted families, but they work with them to help put that public pressure out there. We need the general public to reach that critical mass that is going to change this. That is 100% what we need. And we also need to stop buying into these ad campaigns and these fixes that they give us. Back last year, Snapchat came out with their ads saying that they were not social media. And we're supposed to believe that. They've spent a lot of money telling us that they were not social media, which is supposed to give us a false sense of security. So that's a big deal. Meta just came out with those teen accounts. Some young people from Design It For Us or an Accountable Tech went out, tested it, and they were able to have harms pushed at them as teens on these teen accounts. So we know those things are not effective, and they basically run cover with that stuff. These companies, they put it out there. The general public will typically believe, look, they're doing the best that they can with these, and look at the things that they're doing. Those are band-aids. Those are band-aids and PR moves to hopefully change public perception. So that's where parents like myself, we stay at it. We keep putting out the reality of what is still happening on these apps. And I'm grateful to groups like Accountable Tech and Design It For Us and Fair Play for Kids and Parents Together and everybody else that is working on this issue right alongside us.
There are many working on it, and that's the good news. And I think, too, using creative and imaginative ways, I think one of the things we've done at NCPC is we've reached out to late night comics and get them aware. And I did notice that when all the CEOs came to Washington to testify that night, and thank you out there, Jimmy Kimmel, if you're listening, they talked about it in a way that resonates differently, because humor resonates differently with people. And I think, I'd love to see, I began my career in the 1980s and was very involved in the music industry and world hunger, which was very instrumental in opening people's eyes and changing minds. And I think we have to really use, because social media more than anything has become part of culture. And if you're going to make a cultural shift, you have to use culture to do it. I think is sometimes we invest a lot in those lobbying trips to come to Washington. Don't stop, Amy, please. They're important. But thinking beyond that more, and getting through some other means. So you've been involved in several documentaries. Tell us about those documentaries, that process. I know I've seen several of them, and they're available for people who want to watch them. And we'll have a resource guide for this episode, which will have links and everything too.
So the first documentary that we did is called Dead on Arrival. And the filmmaker, Christine Wood, the producer, actually reached out to me. We lived in the same area, and she made drug prevention education films. And she asked me about it, if I was interested in doing this with, using Alex's story for awareness. And of course I said yes, because I think that Alexander's death cannot be for nothing, right? So some drug dealer can make a couple bucks. We got to bring some meaning to it. And this is one of the ways that we do that. And so we made Dead on Arrival. I invited some dads that I knew into being in that film with us. And then from there, 2 years ago, we've actually funded one of the films, the follow-up film to that, called Come Back Home, which is from the youth perspective. It's all young people who've lost somebody. In the meantime, some reporters, some journalists, masters going to school at UC Berkeley had made a film called The Safest Place. And that features some of Alexander's story in there and the fight against Snapchat. And then more recently, Bloomberg Media has put out a full-length documentary called Can't Look Away. And it does an amazing job of explaining why this is such a challenge and why we need to make these changes. And so for anyone looking to get an education, all of those will give you, you'll walk away having learned something.
Right. No, and I commend folks to take a couple hours out of your week and watch some of these. Have the tissues nearby, but you'll learn so much. It will open your eyes just so widely.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you just didn't stop there, too. You tried a path which has previously been shut off to people trying to go after social media companies. You went to court with a civil case.
Yeah.
And I think I was optimistic, and I think much to your surprise, probably more so than anyone else, the judge has allowed it to proceed. Because previously, social media companies were successful in getting similar cases dismissed on First Amendment grounds. I'm of the viewpoint that this country would be on a dangerous and slippery slope if we start affording drug dealers First Amendment protections. But anyway, tell us a little bit about the lawsuit. And you are not the only parent. You are an organizer by nature.
Yeah. So we, my gosh, 4 years ago now, set out to see if we could sue Snapchat, for lack of a better way of explaining it. I met a woman, Gretchen Peters, from the Alliance to Counter Crime Online, and she said, have you ever thought of suing Snapchat? And, that parent who had told us that, oh, let's work with them from the inside, had told us all, well, you can't sue Snapchat. And I believed them. Well, Gretchen says you can sue whoever you want. And like the clouds parted, and I had this moment of clarity of like, oh, we can sue Snapchat and create awareness and be a problem for them and maybe affect some change, but maybe not win. And I'm okay with that. Like, I want to find a way to spread the messaging any way we can. And so she introduced me to Carrie Goldberg, who then introduced us to the Social Media Victims Law Center. And we filed, and yeah, we're in discovery right now. Like, we honestly thought that they would throw out the Section 230, which basically says that these folks are all creators of content and the platforms can't be held accountable for the content. That's loosely how how these social media companies translate it. But the judge said, we really don't know what this is, and this is worth looking at. And so here we are working on in discovery and working on the next steps. In theory, the trial will start probably early next summer, hopefully.
Right. And for those unfamiliar with the legal process, discovery is important because the company is going to have to turn over documents, memos, emails, and a lot of that will have information. I know that the Justice Department, DEA, is going to be looking at that discovery. Multiple state attorneys general are looking at that. They are already examining class action suits against social media companies on drugs. And that provides evidence. Now, you have seen more than the average person directly from Snapchat. At this point in time, do you think it would be helpful if some of these CEOs and corporate executives were indicted on criminal charges?
Well, short answer is yes. I mean, Snapchat has had a reputation for not cooperating with law enforcement. So in my opinion, they're obstructing justice at that point. They have impeded investigations, including my own, against the drug dealer in Alexander's case. And so I think those things are criminal worthy. In my opinion, in prior testimonies prior to 2024, Snap executives have lied on the stand. And that's important. We can't let them get away with that. But at the time prior to 2024, a lot of our legislators really didn't know the right questions to ask, and were leaning on these tech companies to kind of teach them. And I think they've learned the hard way that that's not how we learn about these problems. And I will say that early 2024 was the first time I saw legislators actually really have a grasp on what they're doing and how that we should be tackling these issues. So I'm grateful for that shift. We need more of it. I do tend to believe that, believe or know, whatever, however you want to look at it, these companies have massive amounts of money and endless resources. That's what we're up against. And I know that they are able to get through to some of these legislators in a way that doesn't help us families.
Absolutely. It's now, having witnessed the number of families that come to Washington and pack these hearing rooms, and then the corporate executives who are there with their attorneys and their lobbyists, there's a stark difference.
Mm-hmm.
Amy's and her family and the other families, your net worth won't rise and fall based on the decision of the committee. But all the others who are there on an expense account, not on their own dime, absolutely will. And so there's a lot at stake, and there were some powerful interests. But you've got to believe that we have numbers of people on our side, and it's not going to happen tomorrow. I think we still have a lot of education to do to get the public more involved. But when that day comes, there is a moment. And what we need to do is be ready for that moment. And what Amy has been so successful in doing is helping make the country ready for when that moment comes, because there will come a time when it's just too much. You know, it's, if you go back to looking at the large movements that have reached a breakthrough moment, it's taken a long time. It takes decades. But when it happens quickly, and it happens because the public has said, no, we've seen enough and we can't watch this again. You know, it comes when, you know, you have the police who turned on the fire hoses and let out the dogs against peaceful protesters crossing a bridge for voting rights. It happens when people say no and call their stockbroker and say, hey, if I've got any money in my mutual fund invested in companies that do business in South Africa during apartheid, take it out. You know, it's going to be those kinds of actions that people can take, and we have to make them aware of it. And we're in the early stages of that. And for people like Amy who try so hard, I know that can be frustrating, because you're like, hurry up, let's get this done yesterday.
Yeah.
But it does take time. And to that end, I think you understand that. And you set up a foundation, the Alexander Neville Foundation. Tell us a bit about that, the resources and your website.
So through the Alexander Neville Foundation, we educate anyone and everyone that will talk to me or listen to me. Even if you won't, I'm going to talk to you anyway. But right now, I'm basically on a conference tour this summer, going into schools, talking to young people in a way that resonates with them. And, you know, I had one really important moment in this career, this new life. A kiddo came up to me and said, you know, we've had drug prevention education before, but this is different. This was real. And that 13-year-old kid validated me in such a huge way. He doesn't know that, but that was probably one of the most important things somebody has said to me to keep me going and keep me working. And so, like I said, everything we do, we create with young people. So we have drug prevention education. We have social media harms awareness. We do digital wellness and literacy programs. We partnered with Healthy Screen Habits. They have this amazing workbook called Healthy Screen Habits. It's a guide to getting your tweens and teens online. And we went ahead and created their drug prevention chapter for them. It's like think of it as like a driver's license manual for putting your kid on their phone or getting on social media and things for the first time. And that's where I really love to spend my time, is talking with young people and their families.
Well, good for you, because that's really important and where you'll really get the benefit. And as that one 13-year-old pointed out, making it real is what matters. It's kids aren't dumb.
Right.
They're very socially savvy in a way parents oftentimes don't realize. And they know when you're trying to snow them.
Yep.
And unless you make it real, it's not going to resonate.
Yeah. That stems from that very first listening session I ever had. And he's like, you know, people are always telling us to say no, but what are we saying no to? And why can't you trust me with the right information? I was like, and he's like, and this one kid said, don't BS me. And I said, all right, deal. I won't ever, you know, so our goal is to make it real and relatable.
Well, you know, and that you do probably better than anyone I know. So we commend you for that.
Thank you.
And thank you. Amy Neville, the Alexander Neville Foundation, and your website is?
It's anfhelp.org.
Alexander Neville help.org, ANF help.org. Well, thank you. And for those out there, don't forget to click like and subscribe. As I mentioned, we will have an episode guide that will have the link to the foundation, the documentaries, and other information where you can become better informed and, more importantly, pass it on to others who need to be aware. And on behalf of the National Crime Prevention Council and McGruff the Crime Dog, thank you, Amy, and thank you for tuning in.
That's an easy way to take a bite out of crime.